Welcome to everyone who's joining us for the YANA evening program. We just went live, so we're going to wait just a few seconds for the participant numbers to come in, and then we'll get started. Okay, why don't we get started? This program is being recorded, and as usual, we will clean everything up and have the video available after the program within a couple of days, including other resources that if anything comes up during the program or people wish to include. So we're very happy to welcome everyone to a special program this evening, Designing for Freedom, the History and Ongoing Crisis of Systemic Slave Labor in the Construction Supply Chain. We have an unbelievable panel with us, and I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Joellen Gray, who's one of the leaders of the YANA New England chapter. Joellen.
Thank you, Rachel. For many of us, thoughts of slavery are tied to ancient Rome and the Civil War, and very far removed from the comforts of our current life. The cruelty of forced labor takes place in another part of the world, and our ability to help is often relegated to charitable donations to NGOs, providing direct service to slavery's victims. Tonight will be an extremely eye-opening view into how closely slavery touches our own lives. David Blight, Sterling Professor of History at Yale, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Frederick Douglass' Prophet of Freedom, and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, will introduce our distinguished panel and moderate this evening's discussion. Thank you all for attending tonight's event, and many thanks to the panel of our leaders at the forefront of designing for freedom. David? David, you'll need to unmute.
Gosh, I did it again. This is my 912th webinar, and I forgot to unmute. Sorry about that. Thank you, Joellen, and thanks to everyone involved with the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. And for me, I have to say, as Joellen mentioned, slavery has, through most of my career, which is decades now, been essentially a historical problem, whether 18th century or 19th century, or at least its immediate legacies. But for the past 9 years, we have now had an initiative at the Gilder Lehrman Center here at Yale, of which I'm director, about modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking. It goes by many names. It is a huge international world problem. We have had over those 9 years about 12 individual fellows who have come here for a year, each of them. We have had people in almost every conceivable discipline. We've had sociologists, political scientists, historians. We've even had a playwright from England. We've had people in literature. And now, of course, in C.deBaca, whom you're about to meet, in law and diplomacy. They have studied prison labor. They have studied organized crime and sex trafficking. They've studied global supply chains. They've studied the anti-trafficking movements, and that, in other words, the modern abolition movement, and all sorts of other subjects. We're very fortunate to have the distinguished former ambassador for human trafficking in the U.S. State Department, C.deBaca, here as our current fellow. We hope to keep him. I will make only one pitch here tonight, and that is that our Modern Slavery Initiative has been funded over the years in part by Richard Gilder, our primary benefactor, and for a couple of those years by the Robina Foundation. But Dick Gilder, of course, passed away last year. All of his support has ended, and the Robina Foundation grant we had ran for 3 years, and that has ended. So if any of you want to help us sustain this project, please let me know. I'm going to simply start this off tonight by mentioning that at Yale now we have a Yale and Slavery Research Project commissioned by President Peter Salovey. Last September, he asked me for my sins to chair this project And this is an attempt to study Yale's relationships or entanglements with slavery over its 319 years of its history. I have established a working group of about 8 faculty, 3 librarians who are crucial to this, 6 student research assistants, 2 very important community people from here in New Haven, a almost retired member of the Yale General Counsel's office. It is a remarkable group of people, all bearing down on this research into Yale's relationships with slavery. Now, we're looking at all kinds of subjects. We're looking at Yale's donor history. We're looking at Yale's labor history, which I'll point to in just a second. We're looking at the demographics of the Yale student body in the 18th century, the 19th century, and into the 20th century. We're looking at Yale's curriculum history. We're looking at Yale's historians over time, because in actually 3 different stages of the modern study of slavery, Yale has been the center of it. And we're looking at Yale's history with abolitionism and many other features. But if we could just go to the slides now quickly, I will start us off tonight by just showing one little example that has everything to do now with the built environment, which is our subject tonight, that has come out already from our research project. This has already been demonstrated and presented once by my colleague, my indispensable colleague, Michael Morand at the Beinecke Library, because he actually found all of this. This is a record of the building of Connecticut Hall. All of you who've been to Yale for a year or more know that Connecticut Hall is the brick building over in the freshman quad. It is the oldest brick building in all of Connecticut. It was built in 1747, 48. This, though, is a map. It's called the Wadsworth Map. Maybe we could even go to the next slide, I think. Yes. This Wadsworth Map, created in 1847, actually Connecticut Hall is 1849, but this map, the earliest known map of New Haven, Connecticut, incredibly beautifully hand-drawn with all these houses on it and so on, has up in its upper left corner a little section that is labeled Jethro's Farm. And on a later map, not too much later, it is labeled Jethro's Corner. Could we go to the next slide? I think it's, yes, there it is, Jethro's Corner. This is a much later plan of New Haven, but as late as 1824, it was still called Jethro's Corner. Now, who was Jethro? His name was Jethro Luke. He was a free Black man who lived in 18th century New Haven. He had a son named Gad, and he had a wife named Mindwell. He was a free man. Now, if you could go back, no, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead to the next slide. Yes, here we are. If you can see here a beautiful photograph of Connecticut Hall as it looks today. That building, built in 1749, was built then as principally it looks now. But what we've learned from records, probate records, and the construction records, and you see some of those records here off on the right, is that approximately 1/3 of the laborers who built Connecticut Hall in the more than a year it took were enslaved. They were, for example, and on these documents you can see this language. I'm not sure you can read it on the document as we've shown it here, but it says, for example, the president's Negro, which would have been President Clapp, Mr. McNeil's Negro, Reverend Noyes's Negro, Theophilus Mumford's Negro, and Mr. Buntian's Negro, and then Jethro and Gad, and then a whole longer list of other laborers. It includes these 18th century Puritan founders of Yale were assiduous record keepers, ladies and gentlemen. Next to every name, they listed the number of days they labored. Jethro and his son Gad, 161.5 days. Mr. McNeil's Negro, 92.75 days. Reverend Noise's Negro, 172.75 days, and so on and so on. We also have records of all the ingredients, the supplies, the materials used in building Connecticut Hall. And what we learned from those records is that Jethro and his son Gad worked with all the lime and the other substances to make the mortar. And we have records of just how many pounds, or would it have been liters then, I'm not sure, of mortar they prepared to build Connecticut Hall. So when you're next on campus, or if you come to a commencement, which of course occurs right in front of this, you have some new information. And lastly, I think if you go ahead to the next slide, or well, no, maybe the next one. I'm sorry. No, sorry, back up if you would, sorry. If we could just back up to that map again. Is it possible to go backward with the slides? Yes, yes. Well, right there, that's fine, that's perfect. Well, last point I will make, that corner, the upper left corner of New Haven at that time and Jethro's Corner is actually the intersection of what is today York Street and the street that the Yale Law School is on. And it's the corner where the Grove Street, it's Grove Street, sorry, it's the Grove Street Cemetery meets Grove Street and York Street. And on that corner, of course, of the campus is the Yale Law School. The Yale Law School was Jethro's Corner. Now, we haven't in any way gotten to the stage in the Yale and Slavery Research Project to make any recommendations yet about anything from memorialization or results of this project. Is going to go on well into next fall, and I will be leading the writing of this. We keep calling it a report, but it is beginning to appear like it's going to be more like a relatively short, I hope, book. But at some point, I do hope that a marker will be placed at the corner of Grove and York about Jethro's Corner. Anyone and everyone who has gone to what many call the world's greatest law school will know that that was originally the farm of a free Black man in New Haven. The built environment is, of course, the people who build it, the people who design it, and the substances and materials that go into that building. Now, I just want to say lastly that at the Gilder Lehrman Center, we are all about all kinds of projects, all kinds of measures and activities, from panels and conferences to fellowships to outreach to students. But we are all about linking past with present. And so I am now happy to turn it over to my three distinguished colleagues, C.deBaca, our current fellow in modern slavery, the former U.S. Ambassador for Human Trafficking in the Obama administration, to Phil Bernstein, the distinguished faculty member from the Yale Architecture School, and with Lou has been teaching an extraordinary new course called Slavery and the Built Environment. And then last but not least, to Sharon Prince, who runs the Grace Farms organization here in Connecticut, and which is a major organization, a major NGO involved in this issue of forced labor and the built environment. So I think, Lou, it's over to you next, and I will come back later and try to moderate a discussion amongst all of us.
Excellent, and thank you, David. I think one thing that is important for folks to know is that David and the GLC are not only supporting my work through the generosity of the university and as we said, Dick Gilder, but also some of the other alumni. Many of you might know John Pepper, who had been at Procter & Gamble, who's been a real leader in trying to get the places where he led, Procter & Gamble and Disney, to confront slavery in their supply chains. And he's always been a great supporter of the Gilder Lehrman Center as well. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't start off by mentioning John Pepper. You know, one of the things that's interesting for somebody who's teaching at the law school, as well as the School of Architecture, for somebody who's working, I'm bridging both parts of the presentation today because I've been working with Grace Farms for a few years now. And, you know, Sharon, I think will take us through the Design for Freedom project at Grace Farms. But I think it's important for folks to realize that this is something that Grace Farms has been working on in Connecticut with victims' rights, with trying to and successfully changing the child advocacy laws in Connecticut so that children in prostitution are thought of as dependent children rather than as delinquents. Working in countries around the world, training law enforcement and trying to improve the financial crimes response to all of this, and the Design for Freedom project that we're going to talk about tonight. So I've been able to work with them on that, for which I'm very grateful. But what is this thing that we talk about when we're talking about human trafficking or modern slavery? I think it's important for us to realize that when we use the term modern slavery, when we use the word slavery at this point, we are not using it rhetorically. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States and every place subject to their jurisdiction. And I think that's a key phrase to remember. It wasn't just outlawing slavery, saying it is ending today, but rather by also making involuntary servitude and by having Congress have the right to enact laws to effectuate the goals of the amendment, it was looking forward. And you see that with people like Frederick Douglass and others in the abolitionist community who had been calling for a way to make it so that you not only ended legal chattel slavery of Africans here in the United States, but also then protected everyone. And as David pointed out in his book, Douglass very soon after the Civil War was warning that this snake will shed its skin and come out in new clothing. And within 3 years, he was out on the lecture circuit warning about the exploitation of immigrants, Chinese, Mexican, and otherwise. So let's take this up to today. We're talking about forced labor. We're talking about the worst forms of child labor. Child labor itself is much broader, but some of those children are enslaved. All of those children should be in school and being able to have a better life. But we're talking about something that estimates, notoriously imprecise, put between 25 or 26 million on the low end when you're looking at forced labor. And then when you add in child marriage, it can get you up to 40 million. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the good thing is that slavery is illegal. Slavery became illegal in the United States in 1865. Slavery became illegal in pretty much the entire Western Hemisphere in the 1880s when Brazil and Cuba finally made it illegal. But slavery has not been illegal for that long in a number of countries around the world. I think most notably Mauritania and Mali, just in the last 15, 20 years, have finally made it illegal. But now slavery is illegal worldwide. It is an international crime under the International Criminal Code. It is a international law violation, and it is a violation of a number of domestic laws. We have up here on the screen some of the most important ones. In the last 15 years, we've seen countries, and especially the last 5 years, we've seen countries moving to prevent slave-made goods from coming into their jurisdictions. And so in the United States, we're actually seeing ships and products being seized at the border rather than being allowed into the United States. So there is legal risk, thank goodness, for those who turn the other way and try to have willful blindness and not confront these things. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I think that it's very important for us to be thinking about this, especially in the context of the built environment. And for those of you who haven't been able to be out at Grace Farms, I think in the slide deck we have a picture of the river building at Grace Farms. But one of the things that I think that we've really seen through the Design for Freedom project is honing in on this idea of what building and what design really means and how that actually impacts the business of slavery. Construction is the largest global industrialized sector, and it's at the highest risk of forced labor. You're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar construction industry, but you're also talking about this slavery that slips into it. Almost as many ungotten gains as we see in drugs or weapons smuggling, $150 billion crime every year. Now, my job was to set the stage and to kind of bring things down. But I think that it's important for us to think about the fact that we can achieve a solution. And that's, if nothing else, that Grace Farms stands for. For me, it's a place of hope and it's a place of determination. And so I want to turn it over to Sharon Prince, who can walk us through a little bit about what together we've been seeing as what might be and what is a way forward. Sharon?
Yes, thank you so much, Lou. Here is the image that you described of Grace Farms. And first, I want to also go back and thank you, Joellen and Rachel and YANA, for inviting us to share the Design for Freedom movement, and which we did launch last fall together with Lou and Phil, and instrumental parts of that, and that we initialized 3 years ago in partnership with an expanding group of industry leaders to design a more humane future without forced labor in our building material supply chain, and to galvanize nonprofits such as yourselves and those that are on the call right now with your YANA group. So this is a terrific opportunity to really galvanize an understanding, but also some responses that can be pretty powerful. And so here we are. This is Grace Farms. As you see depicted in the image, it's an 80-acre respite located in New Canaan, Connecticut, about 45 minutes south of Yale. We established Grace Farms as a publicly available platform for Grace Farms Foundation, so I hope many of you have been. We do convene people across sectors to help address pressing humanitarian issues. And through this open architecture, you can see here, we break down barriers between people and sectors and invite conversation and create these proximities. So this is where our stake in the ground to end modern day slavery through policy, training, and advocacy that Lou noted met our investment in architecture and surfaced one of the most challenging ethical questions of our time by recognizing this void in the global design and construction sector. So the question that was raised is, are our buildings being ethically sourced without forced labor, as well as sustainably designed? Now, all buildings, including Grace Farms, around the globe are built with materials that have a high risk of forced labor and child labor. And now too, when you think about it, not one modern building can be certified without forced labor in its thousands of materials. Alarmingly, not even a few of those materials. So this is why we designed and launched Design for Freedom. We have been bringing together more than now 60 leaders of industry, including Lou, Phil, and Dean Deborah Burke here at Yale, along with deans and practicing professors at 12 other universities, corporate partners, media, artists, design teams, and many others, thankfully, who are bringing their wherewithal to address forced labor in the building material supply chain. So this is essential because up to this point, the construction sector, which we have noted is the largest industrialized sector in the world, has essentially had an ethical material transparency pass. And as part of the Design for Freedom, we issued a 96-page report that Lou, Phil, and 30 additional experts contributed to. And then we launched also a dedicated website with tools, research, and resources. So we will add this to the chat so you have the links and can get more information and also download the report. So as we heard from David Blight, which is incredible to be on this panel all together, we really cannot ignore our past and the role that slavery has played in building here in the United States. So what we're talking about today is one of the most challenging ethical questions, which immediately does confront the hard reality of economics and the return on investment. Are owners subsidizing their ROIs with slavery? And the answer is likely yes. And are they doing so unknowingly? We definitely are. And this isn't me, we can talk about this later, but like I said, we did not really surface this issue until after we opened, even though we had a stake in the ground to end modern day slavery. It's not until really in conversation to really understand that this is a significant and really terrifying blind spot in the industry. So as part of this work, we had to first come together and figure out who influences the building supply chain. It's really all of us, because all of us live in the built environment. No one is really exempt. But over the past several decades, strides have been made in our essential industries. You think about first food, second clothing, and next will be shelter. That's really the aim here. We're thinking about ways to apply pressure. You can see in the bolded areas how to add labor inputs into each of these sectors, from architecture and design teams to specifiers, universities, and others. And one thing that's been really a bit of an epiphany is that we're thinking about who actually does have the ability to to create the change. And so this notion that design teams are not culpable, as a response, architects Jing Liu and Florian Eidenberg of Seoul Il, they note that our designs define the labor needed to extract the materials from the earth, the labor to clean it, to process it, assemble it, transport it, and build it on the construction site. So specifiers are, now starting to, they have to think about the building codes, which Phil can talk about later too, that the pass mustered, but there's also an adherence to ethical and legal codes like TIFTIA that, Lou will likely describe, and as part, which is, something you could try in terms of the other laws that exist, but as part of Design for Freedom, we are proposing ways for everyone in each of these areas to incorporate building materials supply chain transparency. So let's take a bird's eye view. We're at the cusp of architecture justice and environmental breakthroughs. Teams are already investigating the structural performance, environmental impacts, and now like this nascent low embedded carbon. But we now want to add labor inputs into our decision-making process and ask where our building materials come from and who is making them. So as an example, Mass Design Group, who's one of the only nonprofit architecture and construction firms, they're just exceptional, and have taught, many of them have taught at Yale, Yale graduates. It's a collective, and they are also a member of the Design for Freedom Working Group. They're partnering with Grace Farms to create an exhibit on Design for Freedom. And they state in their mission to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. And this is really what it's about. So we're extending that definition of environmental sustainability to really recognize, people around the globe. And that would be the next, hopefully the next leg. So the question that I hear most often, or we all do, is that after the quick realization that there must be forced labor and construction materials, okay, so ask me, which materials do I need to avoid? And well, there was not an existing list of the most at-risk construction materials when we started. So we pulled them together. That was Lou, who is, pulled together a lot of different research to put this list together that is both the raw, really considers both the raw and composite materials. It's not a weighted list, but it does really, when you look at it, comprise nearly all of the materials in the building. So these thousands of materials that go into the building, we really can't assume then that they are ethically sourced when the supply chain is opaque. And there's also just the sheer number of materials, thousands of them, the origination countries, global routing, and there's a disaggregated supply chain as well. So now going just to one of them, that Phil will talk more about is steel. It's really quite fascinating as really material. It does have sustainable properties, and at the same time, it does seem monolithic, but the materials you see here are part of the steel that is often extracted, smelted, casted, and rolled in hazardous conditions and do circulate the globe. So it is really daunting, but promising as we aim to shift sourcing to ethical and transparent vendors. And every time we do so, we're accelerating the movement to design for a more humane future without forced labor in our building material supply chain. So, Phil, I'd like to pass it off to you to talk a bit more about materials and the Yale class, which is essentially a master class. It's pretty incredible that you and Lou stepped up and led last semester. So,
thanks,
Phil?
Sharon, and thanks to YANA for inviting us to speak on this topic today. Yeah, Sharon is correct. Lou and I met as part of the working group at Grace Farms, and with Sharon encouraging us, we decided to teach a class at the School of Architecture this past fall semester on a topic that we were sort of figuring out as we went along. My work is about trying to understand how the decisions that architects make affect the supply chain and what the relationship is between design decisions and the ultimate manifestation of a built artifact. And so Lou and I began to combine our disparate expertise. I'm somebody who knows a lot about the building industry and nothing about the legal profession. And Lou knows a lot about slavery and the law, but was being introduced to the world of architects. And in that overlay, we put together a course that was comprised of, we had a law student, an undergraduate economist, and a bunch of my architecture students to try to examine this question of forced labor in the supply chain. And I'd say on behalf of my colleagues in the architecture profession, 99% of the time when you say to them, we're working on this question, they look at you with bright, wide eyes and say, I've never even thought about this before. This isn't a question that's even entered into my consciousness. So we began to examine this issue in our course from a number of different perspectives. This is a diagram that Lou and I built to try to explain to our students how, on the left-hand side, you see these bubbles that are the architect and the engineer working for the client, how an early decision as a designer to build a steel building in the United States likely enslaves a worker in Brazil, because that man lived in the tropical rainforest that was stripped in order to create the charcoal that was used in the smelters that created the iron that eventually became sold as Brazilian pig iron to a steel supplier, who then sold it to a steel fabricator, who then rolled it into shapes and sold it to a steel erector, who built it in your building. And that you as the architect, even though you are 10 degrees of separation away from that decision, you have essentially enslaved that laborer. Next slide, please. So we were trying to understand how we could conceptualize this problem, and we began to look at it through the models that have been created for other supply chain problems in the building industry. This is the work of our faculty colleague, Alan Organsky, who studies the circular carbon economy. And what Lou and I began to realize is that there were strong analogs between understanding the relationship between embedded carbon and embedded enslaved labor in the industry itself. And so we began looking at the ways that supply chain modelers and architects like Alan have looked at the mapping of carbon literally as it comes out of the ground into materials and then assembled into a building. And we began to do research in how we might understand whether we could model labor as an embodied quantity as a way of mapping it onto the overall supply chain. And that turned out to have a series of incredibly difficult technical problems that we're going to have to continue working on in the future. Next slide. We also, with Lou's background and with some help from David, we looked at the historic questions of enslaved labor in the built environment and tried to make our students understand that much of the environment that they're working in today has an incredible legacy of enslaved and forced labor. we looked at the really interesting example of Thomas Jefferson, kind of heroic founder of the democracy and one of the nation's first architects who embraced a Neo-Palladian classical Enlightenment view of architecture. This is a plan on the left of and a drawing that Jefferson did of Monticello. Monticello was literally and figuratively built on the work of enslaved people. The house itself had an upper level where the owners and Jefferson lived, and the servants were literally below the ground under the foundation. And the economics of Monticello was not based on Jefferson's work as a farmer, but more we learned from some of the work that Lou described. Jefferson ran a nail factory at Monticello that was essentially, the labor force from that nail factory was essentially 10-year-old children. Turns out a 10-year-old child is the perfect size to make nails. And so Jefferson was literally driving his architecture and his reputation based on enslaved labor. And we want to continue to research that problem a little bit later. Then we ask our students to do a series of projects, as architects are wont to do. They took the definition of the architectural problem pretty broadly. There are two example projects here, one of a portal that the students designed that described the sources of different sorts of enslaved labor in the built environment. The project on the right here was a moving exhibition where you could choose a material or some other component of the supply chain and park this installation in, say, parking lots of other kinds of projects so the public could quickly understand as a sort of museum idea how these things would work. The next slide. A series of our students got really interested in the systems of enslaved labor and how social media and blockchain and the cloud could be used, leveraging the ubiquity of internet-enabled devices to break the chain of labor brokers and money and control in the overall system. And so I think what we realized at the end of the semester was we were sort of looking up at the bottom of a very large, complicated, challenging problem that has historical and technical and legal dimensions. It's going to take a lot more work. So our plan at Yale is to continue doing that work over the next couple of years. Next fall, Deborah Burke, who's the dean, and I have worked out a series of courses that we're going to be teaching. In the fall, David and Rodney Leon, who is an architect in New York, whose work you're seeing here, Lou and I will be teaching a seminar that will try to extend some of these concepts. And that seminar is going to form the basis of an advanced design studio that Rodney will teach in the spring with David and Lou and I supporting that. Rodney was the architect here of several memorial projects in New York, the one on the left at the UN Plaza, the one on the right outside the Federal Building. Rodney is really the most important memorialization architect in the United States, an African-American who I'm proud to say was one of my students back in the day. And Rodney and David and Lou and I are going to try to teach a series of courses next year that'll continue this work. And we're hoping to get enough forward momentum that we can continue for the next couple of years. So with that, I'll hand it back to David and we can have a broader conversation. David?
Oh, well, thank you, Sharon, Phil, Lou. All right, let's start with this, if you don't mind. Sharon, and then Lou and Phil pipe right in. Let's say we had a gathering at Grace Farms, which I know you have, Sharon, many of them. Now, I know what an abolitionist meeting would look like back in the 1840s. I can tell you how they'd operate. They'd have a series of resolutions. They'd have 5 speakers. They would speak to this resolution, that resolution. I have a fairly good idea what their arguments would be. They would try to reach their audience in the heart, with morality and religion. With time, they would also try to reach them with political creeds, but they would reach them, they hoped, with their argument about the complicity of their audience with this system in the South and in the hands of a William Lloyd Garrison or a Frederick Douglass and others, they would make their audience's ears ring with their own guilt over this system. Now, I'm not saying that's what has to be done here at all. It's not for me to say. But how do you reach people in the building trades, in the construction, in this massive international industry? What are the methods of this argument today? And then we might actually begin to think about how we can draw off the past for that or not. Sharon, you might want to take that first.
Well, first of all, I love the idea of an abolitionist gathering within many sectors, though. We want everyone to come, because that's part of the plausibility of actually shortening the timeline, because that's our aim, is to really truncate the timeline that I've seen in the past that you've described. Look how long it takes for these, for this realization to take hold. And I believe that there's a number of this is why we are bringing together the full ecosystem, because I think that is where we have a much greater possibility of applying not only pressure points that will definitely include the ethical moral claim. Like that, to me, what hits to me is that I built Grace Farms at the same, I'm an owner. I built it with the same understanding that I wanted to create a platform to be able to address modern day slavery that I've seen over 2 decades. It's just entropic. It's just, there's no finger in the dike. It keeps expanding with very little impunity and so forth. So that's why we added in training and so forth. But what happened is that this is now the opportunity to shorten that timeline by not only thinking about, okay, am I subsidizing my project? Did I subsidize my project with slavery? I mean, that is a horrible thought, and we did the forensics on the building, on some of the materials. And if we just asked the questions sooner, then we could have actually created more transparency and understanding of who built the supply chain. So we want to initialize it with asking the questions, but also recognizing that how different are we than what you described? How different are we? Yes, Liv. This
is the issue, right?
Right.
This is the issue.
Right. So I do want to have that gathering, and I want you to come, and I want you to.
All right.
We've got great. We'll have. There's lots of possibilities, but it's going to be important to take it from so many different angles, and we can talk about that more. I'll let you all interject. This is how we do it, all three of us.
That's right.
Exactly. Can I jump in, and then
Go ahead, Lou.
I want to ask Phil a question. It's so interesting because Sharon and I, with one of the other key members of the working group, were at a thing recently over at Cooper Union. And, it really struck me that here you have Cooper, who was indentured as a child in the late 1700s, white, but still indentured as a child, who then, when he became wealthy from inventing railroads and the telegraph and all those other things, the I-beam, which is what we use every day in construction, he then ends up putting all of his money into that educational institution, which I think people still go to for free.
Almost.
These years, almost for free, all these years later. And, it struck me while Nat and Sharon and I were talking about this issue of modern slavery, that Lincoln burst on the national consciousness because he gave the House Divided speech at Cooper Union, where he basically, even though he told everybody he wasn't an abolitionist, he basically put down the plan for what was going to have to happen to end slavery. And so he ended
that speech with the line that right makes might.
Exactly. And that's, to me, so I've talked to Sharon and to Bob and to all the other folks at Grace Farms. It's like, we've got to, I think, what we see at Grace Farms is a very audacious short time frame of let's get this changed.
Yeah.
But it's also that long time frame. Cooper left a legacy of abolition that Sharon and I were then able to walk into this last fall on a Zoom call, and to be able to talk to these students and to say, let's pick up that mantle of abolition. let's pick up that mantle of education for scrappy kids who just need a shot and they can go out and be engineers and architects. Let's pick up the mantle of what Lincoln and Cooper themselves did. And let's use that to put forward an entire new generation of abolition.
So Phil, how do you approach your colleagues who come to you agog when you tell them about this and they've never heard of it?
Well, first I want to respond to your original provocation because I think it's really important.
Okay, yeah.
And I want to say that I've been around the building industry long enough that I've seen at least one of these existential crises dealt with, which was climate change. And one of the reasons I really admire the work that Sharon is doing is that she's learned a lot from that playbook and is moving things a lot faster than the 20 years it took us to get our arms around climate change. But in the building industry, because it is so disaggregated, and by that I mean it's made up of lots of little entities who only stay together for short periods of time. And during my practice career, I worked on 14 projects with 14 different contractors. And so there aren't these permanent coalitions.
So you collaborate until the budget's gone, then you move on.
Or till the project is finished or you get sued, whichever comes first, right? But in any event, sorry, Lou, I had to make that joke.
I love it. I love it.
So there are three things that move the building industry in concert. Owners, meaning clients, money, and policy, right? So if owners, especially large institutional owners, say, this is something we want to change, then the iron filings will line up in the direction of the magnet, I like to say, because we all will pay attention to what owners are doing. So if the government is moving in one direction or large institutional owners are moving in one direction, the industry will gravitate in that direction. Secondly, has to do with money, whether it's tax incentives or profit incentives. The margins in the building industry are so narrow that you can move the needle by pushing money. And then the third thing is policy, whether it's labor policy or enforcement protocols, or the example from the green building movement is the LEED movement, which is a perfect example of all three. The sustainability movement really took off when clients started saying, the people that use the buildings that I'm building want a more sustainable building. And renters would pay a higher lease. And governments began saying, you're not going to get a building permit until you get a LEED certification. And then we began to move. So
and Phil, and we had a question from Margot McMahon on the chat. When GSA started insisting on LEED certification, that ended up having a huge market maker.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, GSA is not building right now very much, but if Walmart started, or Starbucks, or Kaiser, or the University of California system, you know, these large institutional owners that create a huge ecosystem of building industry suppliers around them, then you'd really see some things moving.
And can we also talk about the TIFTIA law? So we do have some other pressure points and ability to even by-step the owners, because there's a legal compliance issue, and I think it'd be important, Lou, if you could just talk about that, because there's two things that we think about is that if whether the owners want an ethical building or not, there's also compliance to laws by specifiers and the procurement side. And also there's an opportunity that we're thinking about in terms of other, avenues, is that the insurance companies also would love to have an out to not have to pay for claims. So when you hear what Lou's going to say about the TIFTIA law, if there's a forced labor goods that come into the country and stop projects, the substantial completion of the project is not met, they might not have to be held accountable. Or, I think there's lots of we're thinking of lots of ways to work around even, owners complying, because quite often they will say, I just can't afford it either. I have to have an audit. And then the answer to that is also, you have a budget. Can you then instead just think about having a smaller project, a 2% less footprint, and pay for the audit. So anyway,
Lou,
with that, yeah.
Yeah.
Lou, are we at really almost ground zero in the legal history of enforcement in this particular realm?
You know, I think so. You know, in the class that I teach over at the law school, which is you know, kind of traces the 13th Amendment and then all the way to now. You know, one of the things that, you know, Pete Daniel in his amazing book on the peonage years, and where he went through all of the government records of the investigations, of the prosecutions, and this is back during Jim Crow, this is back during sharecropping, this is back during convict leasing. You know, he ends up, he's the only other historian I know besides you, David, that puts poetry into his books. And, you know, he quotes Langston Hughes. And
there are actually a lot of us.
Well, if Pete Daniel does it, then I think it's something we should all aspire to. But, you know, he basically says, you know, is it that justice is blind, or is it that justice is blindfolded, or is it that justice has had her eyes taken out? And I think that that's one of the things that we saw with this Tiftia law that Sharon mentions. It is a new law. We were able to get it done when I was in the administration under President Obama, with especially with Ron Wyden from Oregon really leading the charge. It was to close a loophole in the 1930 Tariff Act that basically said, we don't want forced labor in the United States. The one thing that we will allow, though, is forced labor in the United States if we really, really need it. And it's called the consumptive demand exception. And it comes down to the fact that we did not make rubber in the United States. None of the United States colonies had rubber plantations.
Ford had to go to Brazil and tear up the jungle to make it.
Fordlandia, right? That crazy town that he made.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that the United States exempts itself from its own prohibition on forced labor, because this is before petroleum. And so you need gaskets. You need gaskets for cars, for airplanes, for tanks. It is national security, and it's the entire economy of the United States. And so this relic of the 1930s was sitting there up until 2016. So the Tiftia law now says, no, globalized economy, this is different. We're different than 1930. No slave labor is going to come into the United States. To their credit, this is something that the Trump administration, I can't believe I'm saying this, but you know, the Trump administration—
We can forgive you, I think.
Exactly. The Trump administration continued this and actually stood up with the help, actually, frankly, of Rod Katabi, who's over at Grace Farms as head of the Justice Initiative, working with Ken Kennedy and others within DHS to stand up these units that are now actually looking at forced labor in other countries. And so there are things like palm oil, which is a big input in so many things. It's on every one of us on this call. It's in our medicine chests. It's actually in a lot of food that we eat. And weirdly enough, it ends up being in things like plywood. Palm oil is ubiquitous. And one of the major palm oil exporters from Malaysia was just prevented from bringing things into the United States because of this law. So I can't overstate how important this Tiftia law is. And it takes people like Rod's former colleagues at Customs, and it gives them the oomph to go after it.
Let me just point out that we've had some good questions here, and Hugo Faria did point out the exact tuition at Cooper Union, and each student does now have to pay half their tuition. Wanted to make sure his point got in there. And Joe Ellen has asked here, I want to bring you back to a big question, all three of you, but Joe Ellen has asked here, how might, I mean, this seems so overwhelming as a problem, but how might people start with the building of their own homes? What about individual homes? I mean, the building trades, the building industry. For example, she brings up asphalt, et cetera, all the ingredients that just go into a single house. Have any of you worked on this, like a consumer's guide to building your own home?
Well, we should talk about our FRDM experiment, Lou, yes?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So when Lou was at State, he helped fund a startup that used artificial intelligence to trace the building supply chain in the manufacturing industry.
Oh.
So if you were a copy machine company, you could go to this startup called Freedom, FRDM, run by a really interesting guy named Justin Dillon. And they would map using like shipping manifests and other kinds of import-export information. They would map out your supply chain and tell you whether there was enslaved material in your copy machine bill of materials. We thought, great, the technology's already here. Let's see if we can apply this to the building industry. So we went to Allen's building that I showed the picture of, which is a Common Ground High School here in New Haven, where we knew everything about every material that went in that building. We picked out about 10 different materials. We gave them to Justin's team to start mapping them. Total failure, complete failure, because the building industry supply chain is so deeply disaggregated. There are so many steps in the process. You know, we put in some building material and the database would come back, oh, the contractor got that at Home Depot. Okay, now what? So there's a kind of fundamental problem of mapping the chains first so we can get them all the way out. So I think
and you know what it does, it ends up rewarding not rewarding the virtuous, but maybe punishing the virtuous.
Right.
Because, you know, one of the things that is in that database, as I understand it, is one of the first, because of the Australian law, and again, this notion of the laws doing something and then pushing it, because the Australian law, James Hardy board, which is a kind of a semi-concrete-ish substitute for wood, they ended up opening up all of their purchasing records to the FRDM platform. And so Justin can tell you everything about Hardy board. But then you come in with a building material that the company has not opened it up to them, and that system doesn't yet talk about it. Now, everybody on the call can look at your own slavery footprint by going to slaveryfootprint.org, which is the predecessor of all of that. And I think we'll all be surprised. We'll all be very surprised at how much slavery is in our own lives, whether it's the thread in the clothes that we're wearing, etc. But I think that what we've all learned is that moving that out into the building trades and moving that out into this very opaque, you know, where Phil took us earlier, David, is, you know, indigenous and African Brazilians out in the Amazon cutting down trees in the way that they were doing it 400 years ago and burning it into charcoal in kilns that look a lot like 400 years ago, so that we can have steel here in the United States.
This is why Sharon's project is the way to go, in my opinion. You have to start at the other end of the supply chain and work your way back.
So you start with CEOs?
We start out in the field with where does this stuff come from?
That other end,
Right. And also just a helpful tool, it's just the beginning of the exploration, is at the end of our report. There's about 30 certifications. It does not tell you the materials, but one in particular that you talked about, Lou, too, is wood. And it is one of the most used materials that we all can pick up a piece of wood to have plywood to add, you know, some protection to your house or something. But the Forest Stewardship Council does have just introduced in the last year the ILO requirements to include an examination of forced labor and child labor. So there's there's the certifications are the other side of it. We now need to also within Design for Freedom also start to pull together. We're initializing pilot projects, which will add to the database that we need, which is very, very thin, very little. That's going to help. And then we're also what's exciting too is a number of the firms that are represented in the working group are starting to put together material libraries and starting to do their own research. And so we're going to pull that all together so you can look at the materials that people, like I said, they just want to know what other materials, right? We all do. And that's the challenge that we're up against right now. But there's
are the companies themselves, these major companies, and Phil, you named a bunch here, Walmart, Starbucks, etc., Home Depot. Are these companies aware of this problem? Because I guess the question I want to get the three of you to weigh in on here is, what is the next step? What if we could put the resources of the Gilder Lehrman Center together with Grace Farms, Yale and Grace Farms, and pull off. And there have been lots of conferences. Now, we've done 2 conferences on modern slavery. They've been very different than what we're talking about right now. But what if we pulled off a conference where we actually got 8 or 10 of these corporate leaders to show up?
Well, let's do it
Let's
because
do it.
Bring their
doable.
key staff people who know where the rubber comes from.
Yeah, I mean, our colleagues from the business school just pulled 100 CEOs together over the weekend to talk about voter rights. Why couldn't we do the same thing?
Yeah, that was exactly where I was going to go with this. If we've got all these companies now falling all over themselves to get right on voting rights, I'm glad they are, but why not this issue? I mean, we should, we do a major conference every year at the GLC, and with your help, Sharon, and others, we could do this. We've done all these. We've done conferences with NGOs and conferences with all scholars studying all kinds of aspects, and journalists studying all kinds of aspects of the modern slavery issue. And we've done some things on supply chains, as Lou knows, great things by Genevieve LeBaron, one of our former fellows. But this question at some point has got to reach these boardrooms, doesn't it?
So 2 things happened just in the last this year. One is that I was able to bring this to the attention of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and also there was a convening of a CEO transformational summit with 50 top CEOs.
Oh, okay.
Also Forbes, who just last week, wrote the outcome of our corporate citizen working group, part of it, and they recognized what I was discussing in terms of corporate citizenship, the most important. I mean, this is an essential human right that's being missed, and they did bring that to the attention of the group in the Forbes article. So people are starting to. We're trying our best to be able to do that. It's a drop in the water. There's a lot farther to go, but I do believe that what you're saying is super important to be able to reach the decision makers that are building these, that are not only building, but they own retail stores, warehouses, data centers. There's so many aspects of it.
Just the data center folks right now, if you could get Apple and Google and Facebook to the table just to talk about their data center construction, that's a huge thing that nobody talks about.
Maybe we could get the Yale, SOM to coordinate on this with us, because they have so much experience bringing in CEOs and so on.
Oh, I bet they would. And
I think that with Kate Cooney over at SOM has done an amazing job of looking at kind of what is value, and are we looking not just the value proposition of should we look at stakeholder value versus shareholder value, which is a lot of folks in the Business Roundtable are looking at, but Kate's even looking at how do we shift those externalities in so that we can end up pricing the product that actually then reflects what happens to those people in the Amazon or what have you. There's a Q&A question that I saw.
Yeah, there is.
I figured we should probably do that, and I don't know how much real estate we have on this Zoom. David, I am the last person you ever want to have as a timekeeper. Everybody on this call.
Well, I think we were
knows
supposed
that,
to wrap up somewhere around 7:30, but let's take this question. It's interesting from Marianne Hamilton. Health companies received a B plus grants for vaccine.
80 billion.
Oh, I'm sorry. 80. I'm
billions.
sorry. I don't do enough numbers like you guys do. Anyway,
B plus.
He's
a total. You're a total professor, David.
Yeah, right. Well,
they got a B plus on that.
Well, they're building new manufacturing plants for vaccines, huge new headquarters, and so on. Have they been asked to consider any of these issues? I guess is the question.
No way.
Yeah, they're all new to every single person. It's new. It's a whole, it's new.
So the new vaccine plants, this whole new phenomenon is just surging ahead.
No way. I'll bet it's never come up anywhere.
So one of the things that, with the Obama era executive order on government procurement, which comes out of Bush era scandals on building our embassy.
Oh, the things Lou.
Right? No, and there's all the classified stuff that I never tell you. But one of the things that we saw over the last 15, 20 years has been an attempt to close some of these loopholes with whether it's overseas contracting. They made a movie out of it with Rachel Weisz about the whistleblowers in the Yugoslavian war, about people using human trafficking, and in that it was using the women. But we had a lot of people who were enslaved by contractors supporting our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so now one of the things that we've seen, but also because of this idea of what is a market maker, just like with the green building movement, once the US government started saying you need LEED certification, it became a thing. One of the things that we were able to do during the Obama administration is that the president issued an executive order that said no federal contracts can end up involving slave labor for whether goods or services. Now, Marianne Hamilton's question, I think, was more about grants, and there is a technical legal distinction between grants and contracts.
But that's a lever.
But it's similar. One of the things that we saw over the last 4 years was that, again, just like with the Tariff Act, the Trump administration did not throw out the executive order on slave-made goods. I think that's one of the things that's so important, because there were many of President Obama's executive orders that did get thrown out in the early months of the Trump administration. This one didn't. And I think it's because there's a bipartisan, if not consensus, but there's a bipartisan agreement that this is who we are as a people. And I think that there is still so much of that bipartisan spirit that we're able to have these conversations on the Hill and otherwise. And so the Trump administration issued the regulations. Now the question that I think all of us as US citizens have to ask the Biden administration is, okay, executive order,
now what?
regulations, are the contracting officers at GSA or otherwise, that involves even like all of the purchasing power of the Department of Defense. They buy more tomatoes and more shrimp than anybody else in the entire country for the food services on the military bases. What about Department of Education or Agriculture for school lunches? Wow. So I think we need to be asking this administration. I think we might be knocking on an open door. Is that the phrase? But I think we need to be asking those questions. What is my tax dollars going to?
Yeah,
it better not be slavery.
Right. If you look at just the Infrastructure Act that's being discussed, that's a perfect leverage point. But I do want to add a note of caution. You cannot hand the industry a giant intractable problem and say, go solve this in total, or we're not going to give you any money. There has to be a strategy. You have to walk with them. You have to walk with them. Yeah, there's a strategy. I could see, we extend the Grace Farms research and we make a long list and we say to these projects, you have to choose 3 unique issues off this list. And in your project, you have to do the necessary research and certification to make sure that these 3 things are slave-free. And in the aggregate, we solve the problem. Because if you say to me, well, you're going to be building $1 billion worth of bridges, but we want to make sure that it's 100% slavery-free, it's an unsolvable problem.
Yeah. Well, or you're incentivizing a lie.
Exactly. You're incentivizing, which is what's happening with certified lumber right now. We're incentivizing lying. So
there's two things that I wanted to jump in on as far as the government's concerned. And first is that that African burial ground that Phil showed us earlier,
Rodney's project,
Rodney Leon's project. I think just today or yesterday they introduced the legislation to expand that and to make it a Smithsonian affiliate, and to actually have an entire museum there in Lower Manhattan.
It's now a national park site, which gives
it is a national park site.
But if it becomes part of the Smithsonian, it's even a higher status.
And so none of us have talked about this, but just by us seeing this today, that this is happening, I think we're all now going to have to circle back and say, if we're going to make a museum or if we're going to make a site there, how do we honor the memory of the enslaved people in New York? And B, that notion of, kind of what the government is or isn't doing, and how you need to do things in transition periods. This week is the anniversary of DC emancipation, the 16th. It's Emancipation Day in DC. It is a state holiday. I say state. It's a state holiday. And you know, the Buffalo
It used to be a
Soldier,
day of a huge African-American parade too.
well, you know, and the Buffalo Soldier reenactors still go up, you know, they go up Pennsylvania Avenue. But
Well,
Lincoln knew that he had to do it gradually. He couldn't just come in and say emancipation. That didn't happen until many months later and many years later.
Right.
But when he had the power to, he did it. And he
There were
did it
about
as a
3,000 slaves freed by that enactment, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that was where it really started, literally. You know, I want, before, I know Joellen wants to come back on here and
tell us to shut up, because we can go on for
Good
a couple
night
of
and
hours
good
here.
Hard to do.
get these people to stop talking. But let me just say, I think we've got the beginnings here of a planning committee for a major conference. We all need another committee.
And
we
Grace
need YANA.
Farms
We need
opening.
YANA as a co.
But I really welcome our friends in the Yale alumni and the YANA organization to perhaps help us out with this. I need to keep C.deBaca employed here at Yale, or none of this will happen. And so call me if you can. But most importantly, there may be a very important kind of conference that we could conceive out of this, that could bring a lot of high-powered people into the same room. Maybe we hold it at Grace Farms. Maybe we hold it here. Maybe we hold it both places since we're so close.
Exactly.
And really get a lot of attention to this question by looking at its roots, looking at its history, and looking at so many of these current questions that Phil and Lou are teaching this course about.
Love this idea.
And we can pull this off. We've done conferences on all kinds of subjects, but we will need some help reaching the corporate world with this. And I think we know a lot of people here who can, and Sharon, you already have many times over. So
I gather them together, though. That's the idea, right? And
yes. That's my, we came out of this with a proposal and a committee. How'd that happen?
It is like it's.
We didn't talk about this ahead of time.
It's a tiny little abolitionist meeting.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's going to be it'll be, and we'll put up a little wood platform with a little lectern, and a flag, and we'll call it an abolition meeting.
We got it.
Love it.
So this is where I chime in to say, we all want to live a life of purpose, and you have proven just in the last hour that can actually happen. I can't believe your commitment, your vision, your incredible skill, and I'm sure that this conference will be a huge success. As an SOM alum, I'm going to say yes, SOM should be involved for its access to its leaders. And thank you all so much for giving of your time and your leadership to this. This is really fantastic. And I'm sure that you're going to say yes if we ask our panelists to reach out to you if they have any additional thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joellen and Tiana.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Bye.
We'll be together again soon. Take care.
Yes.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.